Welcome. Hi, everybody. My name is Ashley Corrigan. I'm GDC's conference manager and head of content. I hope you've been enjoying GDC Showcase so far, and I'm really glad that you can join us for this session that we have today. We have co-CEO of Brace Yourself Games and co-founder of Fair Play Alliance, Dr. Kimberly Voll, with us. Kim is a game designer, developer, researcher, and GDC Advisory Board member. And she's here to talk to you a little bit about GDC's submission process and answer any questions you have about what advisors look for in proposals if you're interested in submitting. The GDC 2024 call for submissions for the Core Concepts program, which is our Wednesday through Friday program. It's going to open July 11th. It'll be open through August 10th. So if you're interested in submitting, definitely take those dates down. And if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or drop them in chat, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. And I think that's it. I think I'll stop talking now. And without further ado, I'll let Kim take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Happy morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you may be hailing from. I'm really glad that you could make it out for this session, and I'm super excited to be here. As Ashley said, this is really your time. This is for any of the questions, things that have been, you're just not totally sure about submitting, or if maybe you've submitted before and you have questions about the process that you've been exposed to so far, et cetera, et cetera. Like, essentially, this is all your time. So Ashley already gave me a wonderful introduction, so I won't bore you with more details about me. Much more interested in all of the questions and things that you have. So yeah, let's jump into that. I see there's already a question in the chat, so I'm just going to jump to that. So thank you, Rima. Rima asks, what are the pillars that you look for in a talk? Which is a great question. I think that there's a lot of different ways you can think about a talk and what a successful talk looks like. But a big piece of it is really how it serves the audience and who you see as your target audience. So depending on to what section you submit. So I've been on the advisory council now for a long time. I don't really remember, 2015 or something. Anyway, it's been a while. I'm on the programming one. So I have a background in both programming and design, although I've not done specific reviews. I've helped out a tiny bit here and there on the game design side, but most of what I've done has been on the programming side. But the process and how you think about a good talk, the bones of a good talk are generally the same. So when I say it really matters about your audience, you really want to think about, first of all, who is your audience? Where are you submitting? If it's a programming audience, you're going to skew things one way. If it's a design audience, production audience, so on and so forth, you really want to think about who's going to be in the room. When you're submitting a talk, you do have an opportunity to say something about your anticipated audience as well. So are you skewing this towards someone who's a little bit, been in the career or been in this space a long time, they've had a long career here, or maybe they're a little bit newer, or maybe this is a talk that is of interest to programmers and designers, so on and so forth. So you have an opportunity to shape a little bit more. But once you've identified what that core audience is, then you really want to build out what the key takeaways are. I think that's probably the most important pillar, is when people come to your talk afterward, what are they going to take away? What are the things that by learning this today, they can do things differently tomorrow? Because a lot of what GDC is about is as practical methods, is really helping equip and empower developers with the skills and knowledge that you bring via your talk, so that they can take those away and apply them in their areas. So knowing your audience, making sure you're being really, really clear as to what you need those takeaways to be. Focusing those takeaways, it can be very easy to kind of put everything and the kitchen sink in there. There's a lot of stuff I'm sure you can share. You've all done a number of different interesting things, but I think you really want to kind of figure out what is that steel thread of the talk. You know, if there's one takeaway that people have, it's this, and then you have these supporting takeaways that go around that. So really focusing on that. And then the other one is just, this is less maybe a pillar and more like a good practice would be everything that goes into the talk. You really want it to contribute to upholding those goals. They should be, if it's not directly delivering one of those goals. So let's say I'm giving a talk on how to design great AI NPCs for a game, and maybe the thing that I really want to get across is something to do with since this is AI based, something to do with how AI contributes to that. Maybe you want to focus on replayability. So if replayability is my key theme as it relates to AI NPCs, then everything I add to that talk, I'm going to be asking, how does this support directly or indirectly my key points about replayability with AI and NPCs? So really having that discipline to hold yourself accountable, to go back and ask yourself, is this doing enough? Is this chunk of my talk worth it? Is it pulling its weight in here? So those are kind of things: the audience, the core takeaways, and then ensuring that every piece that goes in there is really supporting those takeaways in a meaningful way. I see Nina has a question. What criteria get an automatic rejection in a proposal? That's a tricky one. I mean, I think we try to never be cavalier with what we're reviewing. So we don't want to look at things and just go, it's out of here. Things that would get like close to an automatic rejection would be a proposal that doesn't have enough content. I think you're given a lot of space to express what you would like to do. And there's kind of two different types of ways in which you can describe your talk, or two different sort of audiences. One is we ask you to describe the talk as if you were describing it to the audience. So your future potential attendees, this is the talk description you would like, and kind of fleshing out those ideas. But the other piece, and this is really critical, is the piece where you talk to us directly, those of us who are going to be reviewing these talks. And that's where we want a lot of detail. That's probably where we see the biggest missteps, is people will put kind of the same thing in both sections. Like, here's what you would advertise to potential attendees, and then they kind of just carbon copy that for us. But what we want in this section is not the sort of marketing speak, come to my talk, it's going to be cool, which is good. It's good to attract an audience and to hype it up. We want the nitty-gritty details of what are you actually going to talk about. So if you are doing a talk on replayability for AI NPCs, we want to know what you know about that, what points you're going to be making, and why you think they're crucial to that talk, what you think the deliverables, the takeaways will be for the attendees, and how you're going to be delivering those takeaways, so on and so forth. So like really getting into detail there. Don't be thinking about like, oh, this is way too much, no one's going to want to read this. Oh, we really want to read it. Please give us the details, because since you can't be in the room with us and we can't ask you questions, this is our best insight into what you're thinking and what you're going to bring to the talk. So I think that's the main thing. There's very rarely an automatic rejection. I mean, if someone submitted a spoof or something like that, sure. But we do try to give everything its due diligence. And even when people are light on details, we'll still try our very best to tease out and understand what's the potential of this talk, where could it go? And sometimes if we think there's good potential, we'll even, when we get to the next round, we'll reach out to people and say, hey, can you give us some more details if we really think there's something meaningful there. And that's an important thing. Let me just, before I'll take the next question in a moment, but let me just say as well, if you're not very familiar with the process, let's say you've never submitted before, there's a few different stages to it. So the first is, like Ashley said, the submissions window will open up July 11th. It goes through to August 10th. So this is when you'll be filling out our form and getting all those juicy details together, and trying to do your best to convey as much as possible what you would like to talk about and what you think the outcomes and value will be to the audience. After that, then it goes into a review phase where we will look over all of the submissions, and all of them. We will look at everything. There's a lot. It takes a good chunk of time, and we go through everything. We read everything in detail. If you submit other talks that you have done or anything supporting, so we'll go look at all of that. Like, we really try to spend our time going over things and giving everything a fair shot. We then all get together in person, and we talk through, after doing that whole review process, we talk through the talks that we think show the most promise. We'll even highlight ones that, as I mentioned, like, there's not enough quite here, but I think this could be really good. We'll flag those so that we can follow up with people. And so what we'll do is, at the end of that big, huge session, is we will come up with a list of talks that we want to move on to the next phase. So the next phase is when we contact you and say, hey, you've been accepted into phase 2, which means that we like what we see. We think there's a really cool potential talk here. We're excited to work with you to hone that into as tight a version of this proposal as possible. So we'll give you all the feedback that we've gathered from all of our colleagues in this space. We'll give that to you. We'll give you a pretty good chunk of time. It's usually, I can't remember, Ashley, it's like 6 weeks or something, 4 to 6 weeks. How much do we normally give?
For the first round revisions, it's like about 4 weeks.
4 weeks. Okay. So it's a pretty good chunk of time, and you're given the feedback, you're given a mentor. So it could be me, for instance. I'll work with you to help interpret the feedback and apply the feedback. And then you can, as I say, hone that into the proposal that you think it needs to be. Sometimes during that phase, we'll ask you to produce a little bit more concrete details. So it could be like a really detailed outline. It could be some slides. It kind of varies depending upon the needs and your experience level, if you've done this before, that sort of thing. And at the end of that period, if we all feel good that, yes, we've really got this to a good spot, this feels like it's ready, the talk won't be done at the end of this, but we all feel we have very high confidence that the remaining steps between now and GDC, you'll be able to get this into an excellent form, and we'll still be there to support. So if we feel that's true, then that's when we'll accept the talk formally and move it on to an official acceptance. So there's those few different phases. There's the submission window, there's our review window, there's if we accept to the next phase, where we let you know you have the feedback, you have some time to respond and refine your proposal, and then there's the window that goes from there to GDC, where you're actually preparing the formal talk. And as I said, we're available there too. So like this past GDC, for example, some of the folks that I were mentoring, I was watching their talks repeatedly, giving them feedback and coaching them. So there's a lot of opportunities there to get additional support. Let's see. Jesse asks, how much are previously similar talks from years past considered when evaluating a new talk? Would a talk that is maybe 70% similar to a talk by a previous dev 3 to 4 years ago face a tougher road to acceptance than one that might be less fleshed out, but in a more unexplored topic? Really good question. Yeah, there's not like a hard science to this. One of the things that we try to look for is if there is a talk on this topic previously, is it still relevant? Is it still something that, today we would point to and say, that's the talk on this topic, go watch that topic. If that's true, that this is still holding up, then we're much less likely to accept something that has a high overlap with that, just because we're kind of doubling up on content and it's probably less valuable to our audience overall. Now, where we draw that line, it can be sticky, right? Sometimes if it's a very complex topic, like let's say, I don't know, a really complex programming topic that there are some pre-existing talks on, but at the end of the day, it's still just, it could use some additional perspectives or ways of articulating this topic, then we'll consider that. It might still be worth adding another talk on that topic as a result. If it overlaps too much, though, we'll start to feel like it's probably not going to be worth it. If it overlaps some, but is adding some new content, like maybe it is, some new state-of-the-art approaches, or it's maybe the same kind of foundational materials, but it takes things in a different direction, then if that shows promise and we think there's a space for that in the upcoming event, what we might do is accept that to the next phase, but then work with you to refine it a little bit, just to be able to say, hey, here's this existing talk. We think it kind of covers this much, so you can kind of reference it and say, if you want a more in-depth foundation, go here, and then we can help work with you to flesh out your more unique contributions as well, too, to find a better balance there. Would a startup really benefit from presenting at GDC? It kind of depends. Some really noisy airplane flying by. Apologies if you can hear that. Let's test how good the noise canceling is. Yeah, would a startup benefit? It really depends. So I think there's a lot of different sources of value for presenting at GDC. One obvious one is, of course, you're contributing to the game development community and sharing your knowledge. And I think that is awesome. A rising tide floats all boats. Being able to share these techniques allows us to all do our jobs better and to push the state of the art and make better games and support players better and all these wonderful things that come out of knowledge sharing. On the flip side, like, what do you get out of it? I think there's a few different things. One is it could be a personal goal. Like, public speaking is a great accomplishment. It can be something you want to work toward, you want to improve on. Perhaps GDC is something that you've always enjoyed and you have aspired toward speaking at GDC, and so this is a bit of a career goal for you. I know at one point that was true for me. Over the years I've given a lot of talks actually nowadays. Been doing this a long time, but earlier on, when I hadn't yet spoken at GDC, I was really excited to have that opportunity, and it was something I wanted to work toward. So it was a very personal goal for me in that regard. For a startup, though, it can be exposure. Now, the point of GDC is not to push a brand. It's not to sell things. There's sponsor sessions for that. And so if this is really more about, no, I want the world to see what my startup is and what we do and potentially work with us, you probably want to look more at a sponsor session. That's to go back to Nina's question earlier about getting an automatic rejection. Sometimes what we'll do is, if we think something is sponsored content, so you are selling something, or we interpret it as selling something, then we would recommend instead a sponsored. So we would reject it from the main core part of the conference, but we may recommend a sponsored session instead. So if you're selling something, it should go over in a sponsored section. If you are teaching us something, so if you're teaching us about a technique or something that any game developer who kind of works in this space would derive value from, then there's probably a reasonable chance that we would consider it, and you get the benefit of being known as having greater expertise in this area. You get the benefit of a well-publicized talk that you can reference in the future, or so on and so forth. So I think the value can be quite varied, but it's sort of trying to understand what is really your goal with putting together this talk. Is it more on the salesy kind of getting your brand out there, in which case probably not a good fit unless you want to consider a sponsored session. If it's really more about, no, we want to get this knowledge out into the game development world and share that with our fellow game developers, then yeah, absolutely, we would welcome it.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions. Does anybody have any other questions you want to drop in or raise your hand? If not, I have some questions that, of my own, that if you don't mind asking, Kim, I'll shoot at you.
Oh yeah, we got one more in the chat. Let me grab this one and then let's bounce over to those. Yeah, just came in hot off the presses. Oh, there we go. Some more.
There you go. Never mind. Yeah, they take precedent. So
all right. So Peter asks, with your extensive experience as a game developer and GDC Advisory Board member, what are some common misconceptions about the proposal process that you'd like to debunk to help first-time applicants submit stronger proposals? Great question. Yeah. I think so. One I already mentioned a little bit was that confusion between how you present your talk as if it would be for potential audience or for potential attendees versus what we behind the scenes really want to see. I think so often I see those get conflated where we don't really get details. We get kind of the sales pitch marketing version of the talk, and that just doesn't give us any details. So I think that is a really, really big one that I bump up against a lot. Another is sometimes I think there's things tend to be presented in the application process in a very high level way. So even though you're giving maybe lots of bullet points, and yes, it's very different than what the attendees would see in a description in the future, it's still very high level. It's not really telling us what's special or unique about this knowledge that you want to bring to GDC. Like, help us really understand why this material is going to be valuable for the attendees. You know, what is it that is unique about this? Make those connections for us, because otherwise we're left to guess at it. And at the end of the day, there's only so much we can do with the material that you give us. So the more you connect those dots for us and really spell out why we think this is why you think this is valuable, the easier it is for us to assess that. So I think that's another common thing is sometimes I think there's just a conception that, oh, well, I just need to give a bunch of bullet points and I've got it. The other thing is, don't be afraid to really spell out your talk as well, too. Like, give me the talk outline in a lot more detail. With this, I'm going to intro here, I'm going to talk about these few things, then this section is going to be about here, and I'm going to make these points, and I'm going to support these points with X, Y, Z, and then I'm going to make these points and X, Y, Z, and then I'm going to close out, and I'm going to round out with a summary of the key takeaways, which are these things, and like, give me that outline. The other misconception I often encounter is, it is a lot of work to submit to GDC. I won't lie. You've got to do your homework. You've got to have a solid grounding of what you would like to speak about. Don't just toss it in a rough idea. There's a tiny chance that if we're really desperate for content of that sort, and maybe you're a really established speaker and we're like, maybe we could come back and ask you to flesh out. We're still going to come back and ask you to flesh it out. Maybe, but it's 99% sure that something that's lightweight, it's not going to be enough, and there's going to be plenty more other submissions that are very well fleshed out. So it is a chunk of work. Be prepared for that. Part of the reason the window is so long, we give you a month, is because you need to take the time to prepare that. That being said, you don't need to have a finished talk. You don't need to get everything ready, prepare all of your slides and link us a complete talk and describe that talk. Chances are almost certain that we're going to work with you anyway, and we're going to bring in additional knowledge about some of the topics we're targeting this year, maybe pulling from past talks we know about. I mean, none of us have complete knowledge of every single talk that has ever happened. There's a lot now. So, there's this intersection of different experiences that we can use to understand past talks and share that knowledge with you and work with you. So you'll end up changing it quite a bit, almost certainly. So I think that's another kind of misconception, is just like, how much work is here? It is a lot of work, but it's not a complete talk. And so keeping that in mind as well. I don't know, Ashley, can you think of any other misconception things? I feel like there's more and they're not coming to my mind. It's a great question.
It is a great question. No, I think you covered it. I think you gave a really good overview of it. I'll have to think though, and if I think of something, then I'll chime in about it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So Ted asks, in regard to selling something and sponsored sessions, does it count as leaning towards sponsored content if you want to talk about a technique you used in making a tool you're selling? Yeah, that's always kind of a gray area, isn't it? I think that the kind of rule of thumb I use in my mind is, how does this relate to your product, and if I would buy this product? Like, if this is a technique you can freely share and I can take this technique for myself and go use it, and I don't need to go buy your product to use it, then I think it's probably fine. Like, it is a valid use case of knowledge sharing. If that knowledge sharing comes with a catch, like I really have to use your product, then it's probably starting to lean a little bit too salesy at that point, because there's a dependency on being able to use that. Now, you might naturally be asking, well, we use a lot of software in this industry. And so what do you do about that? Like lots of people use Unity, lots of people use Unreal, for example. We debate that a lot. That's probably one of the biggest debates that we have is this sponsored content or is this legitimate? I think where we try to skew things is where GDC we want to have as broad an appeal as possible. Now, that's not to say you're giving a programming talk and so therefore every game developer needs to get value out of this. No, but it should have broad appeal to the subset of the GDC audience that are programmers. And so we tend to bias towards broader appeal. So if something is kind of, for lack of a better word, locked behind some sort of proprietary software, or proprietary method, I guess, in some cases, then that's going to probably deter us because we know that's going to have a much more limited audience. If it's a huge scale, like just everyone uses this or a huge portion of the industry uses it, then we might still consider it. But again, if it's still getting into the salesy, where like at the end of the day, it's really hard to disentangle the sales pitch from the software or the technique or whatever it is. That's where we're going to be like hyper focused and making sure we can disentangle that. And if we're not sure, then we will default to not including it. We really, really want to maintain that our core, the non-sponsored sessions are very much about open knowledge sharing as much as possible.
So,
sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just thinking, kind of going back to what you were saying. I don't know if this is necessarily like a common misconception, but one question that I've gotten before is how do you know if you have 30 minutes worth of content or 60 minutes worth of content? So we have different formats that we accept depending on the program that we have. Should probably back up. GDC has technically three different programs. There's the Core Concepts program, which runs Wednesday through Friday. We accept lectures, panels, and roundtables, proposals on those. And then there's also summits, which run Monday and Tuesday, and those are just lectures and panels that we accept. And then on Friday, we have the Game Career Seminar, which is also, we accept lectures and panels. So for the lectures, we have the two formats of 30 minutes and 60 minutes. And those are the most proposals that we usually see. Do you have any advice around whether, someone should select a 30-minute or 60-minute and how do they know?
Yeah, boy, do I. Great question. Yeah, this comes up a lot. It can be a hard question. So I have a few different thoughts on it. First is if you are relatively new to speaking, maybe you've never spoken at GDC, but maybe you've never spoken at all, which is cool. I still encourage you to submit. But if you're a little bit newer, I would definitely steer you toward 30 minutes. It is a lot to get up there for if you're not really accustomed to this and speak for 60 minutes. 60 minutes is a lot of content to produce, and it's a lot of content to produce well. A lot of times there's I think, feeling that, well, when you start putting together your talk, you've got all this stuff comes tumbling out. You're like, oh, I've got all this content. I'm never going to fit it in 30 minutes. And so 60 minutes can feel like the easier target, but it's really not. I think what I encourage most people to do is start by just getting out what you want to talk about. So what is your goal? What is your target audience? To pull this back to what we were talking about at the beginning, what are the key takeaways that you want to have? What is the kind of narrative steel thread? So you're going to introduce yourself, and then you're going to introduce your point that you want to advance and build on throughout, and you're going to build it in these ways, and then you're going to tie it up in a nice bow, and you're going to summarize the takeaways at the end. Figure out what your narrative structure is. And that stuff, when it comes to the mentoring phase, we will help you with. If you don't have the full structure nailed by the time you submit next month, that's okay. It's more about the content. We'll work with you on how to deliver that really well. But starting with that, and just at this point, I also used to be a university professor years ago. So if you count lectures, then a gazillion more on top of that. But in terms of like actual prepped talks over the years at different events, probably over 100. And I always start in a very similar way of spelling out all of those pieces. And then I start dumping in kind of note form what all of, I think, the key supporting points are till I've got this big blob of text that's a huge old mess. And then from there, I start lifting out pieces. And I'll usually at that point start putting them on slides just so I can start to get a spatial sense of the flow, and I can drag slides around and move them around. And that'll give me a sense of the overall narrative. And then I'll try to tighten that up. And notice I'm not really saying a lot about the time right now. I'm not paying too much attention to that. But this is about the time when I start thinking of, okay, if I'm targeting a 30-minute talk, what I really want to try to do is figure out, given any 2 points I could make, I want to know which is the most important to my core takeaways, the things that I really want people to walk away from. And so I'll start stripping it down, stripping it down, stripping it down. And that exercise of going through that, you'll probably do that several iterations, but that exercise is really what distills the talk into a really tight talk. If you don't have that pressure of trying to figure out a smaller talk, it's very, very easy to fall into the trap of just having a lot of kind of extraneous points that aren't really adding a lot and ultimately kind of dilute the overall presentation that you're putting together. So 30 minutes ends up being a pretty good window so you can still get a lot of really good stuff in 30 minutes, but it's a very good exercise to force yourself to figure out exactly what fits in those 30 minutes. And when you get down to the point you're like, I'm at 40 minutes, this is impossible. Like, yep, keep going. There's still points you can take out. And if you ever take out a point and you feel like, my whole talk just fell apart, like, okay, well, maybe that point has to stay, or maybe you're thinking about the talk the right way. So, don't be afraid to talk with your colleagues, even your friends who maybe don't necessarily have the development background that you do, but will understand a narrative, kind of just spelling out for them. It's just the exercise of talking it through again, honing it, refining it, speaking to points more efficiently will help you continue to focus and understand that. Now, when do you want, we have 60-minute slots for a reason. When do you have that? When do you want that? Well, as I say, less as a beginner. I think if you're more experienced, it's a lot easier. You've honed those skills to be able to deliver a longer talk with more structural integrity and focus end to end throughout that talk. But even then, I still usually, personally, tend to skew to the 30 minutes because I think those tend to be a little bit more digestible for the audience. But when I do skew toward a 60-minute, either in my own talks or when I'm working with someone and producing their talk, it's because there's that much content. So it's usually much more technically detailed. I don't just mean programming technical in that sense, but also it could be methodology, like very technical in terms of how you actually do this. And so there's a lot more to build up, and you want to spend time with examples, and those just take time. In a 30-minute talk, you're going to have to rush through those things. Whereas if you have a little bit more time, sometimes really fleshing those out, or if you have some videos to show and whatnot, that can make a lot of sense. But I would try to stay very disciplined and constantly interrogate and reinterrogate yourself. Do I actually need 60 minutes? Because most of the time, 30 minutes is probably the right size. And even then, I would try to figure out how you get it, apply the rule of what would this look like as a 20-minute talk, and then pull back in the things to really, that way you can be very, very intentional about surgical precision, inserting things back in to really hold up and land that talk solidly. Let's see, where are we? Elizabeth asked, do you accept previously presented talks at other conferences, or do you prefer to be the first? Yeah, we don't usually. I can't remember, Ashley. Do we have a rule that says we can't? I feel like we just normally don't.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it needs to be original content. It can't be presented somewhere else, but I think that it's fine to build off of a previous presentation if you're able to do that. But like you mentioned, it needs to be something new, something that you're really bringing new to the GDC community in order to be accepted.
Thank you. Yeah. And we'll go watch those sometimes because, sometimes there's clearly, I've been in conversations where we've gone and watched a talk and we've been like, yeah, we can't take the exact same talk, but I can see another talk in here that might be really interesting. And so we'll, potentially, if it's something that we think would really fit with the programming that we're building out for the year, then we might follow up and say, hey, would you be interested in submitting a talk that focuses more around these things? So it's more original content. Yeah, great question. Rima, how do you work around references and talks that might negatively or positively reference one of your sponsors or other gaming companies the speaker doesn't work for? Yes, diplomacy. That can be challenging for sure. Sometimes there's just things that you can't talk enough about to build a coherent narrative. And if that's the case, then, it's probably not a really good fit. We've had times, for example, where we've accepted a talk, we've worked with the speaker, and at the last minute, they're like, actually, I have to redact all of this. And we're like, cool, there's no talk left. So that can happen. And one of the things we encourage people to do is as early as possible, like if you're thinking about submitting a talk now's probably a good time to start having the conversation with your company and stakeholders about any restrictions on the content to avoid situations like that. But in terms of sort of how, nonetheless, there's going to be a lot of things that you could talk about that you want to be conscientious about what light you cast them in, particularly if they're a sponsor or whatnot. I think there's ways to approach that. Generally, I would say if you can, try to abstract it. Don't mention the sponsor. Lift out what is the key learning. If it's working with I don't know, now I'm drawing blanks, but if it's working with a particular piece of software and in your mind, you're like, it's, company ABC's software, is that very specific to company ABC? Or is it more like, okay, when we're talking, let's say you're in production and you're talking about project management software, and you're like, that's Jira, totally thinking about Jira there. You don't have to necessarily talk about Jira. It might be the sort of thing where you can talk about the software more generically in terms of how it represents tickets and workflow, and if you do agile, is it Kanban, is it whatever. So I think if you can abstract it away, that's fine. So if you're critical, then I would just be mindful of not pointing fingers. The other thing as well too is I always encourage everyone to keep this in mind. If you're talking, so this is less so about like proprietary or companies, that sort of stuff, and more just generally talking about development. Just always be compassionate too. If you're talking about something that didn't work, it was an experiment, it failed, it was a result of a mistake. GDC is not about showcasing mistakes. It's about showcasing learnings and doing so in a respectful and compassionate way. Like, we all have made plenty of mistakes. I know I've made plenty of mistakes. I will go on to make plenty of mistakes, as will you all, pardon me. But a big part of GDC is coming together as a community to learn from these things. And it takes a lot of courage, of course, as some of you may already be aware or are aware now, and just in contemplating a submission, to get up on that stage and share your story. And sometimes when you're on that stage, you have the honor and responsibility of sharing a story that's bigger than you. This maybe isn't just your experience, but is the experience of you and a team, or other colleagues that you may have worked with. So I think carrying that compassion forward to them as well when you are building your narrative and thinking about how to represent things, frame it in terms of learning. Don't, resist the trap of, oh, if they'd only just done this. Decisions are always made as a product of the context at the time. And we weren't exactly there. We don't know the full story of why those decisions were made exactly. There may be information we're not aware of, or even if we were there, that we're not aware of. And either way, even if you're like, yeah, but in this case, they really did screw it up, it's still, I think, better to take an approach of respectfully talking about the learnings, not pointing fingers, and remembering that the goal here is to teach others and give them good takeaways, rather than to, relitigate past decisions or point fingers or, otherwise, I think, blame others for past things. So yeah, that's kind of how I would frame things on the whole.
Yeah, and I want to underline that point that you made too, Kim. So about getting studio, of course, someone's in the kitchen right now. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's really important to get studio, PR, legal approval, hopefully prior to submitting, because that's part of the reason why we have this phase 2 process, or why it's really helpful, is that we see a lot of, once like the content starts to flesh out, we see a lot of talks actually have to be canceled because the speaker didn't get approval prior to submitting or starting to put together the presentation. And it's really heartbreaking to announce a talk and then have to cancel it. So yeah, definitely highly recommend, or really encourage folks to get approval prior to submitting.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rima, I see your addendum there as well, an example of a patent that generated tremendous negative community response in regard to an AI software. That patent was by a specific company. So again, I would probably, if you could, genericize that to talk about the challenges faced around AI software, generative AI software, if that's the sort of thing that you're talking about, without pointing fingers. But it also, the other thing I would keep in mind too is GDC talks they're rarely an opinion piece. They're much more about practical takeaways. And so always asking yourself as a good filter of like, what is really the practical takeaway here? I mean, we sometimes do kind of, we'll do like classic postmortems and stuff, which are a little bit more narrative. And so there are times when it is appropriate to tell a story, and that story is itself a key learning. But I think really trying to focus on what do you want the audience to take away? Is this more about me wanting to vent about a particular thing that I've seen, in which case, yeah, it's probably not the right venue for that? Or is this more about, you know what, there's a really good learning here, and I want to make sure that others are aware of that, or at the very least, they're aware of the complexity, the here be dragons kind of aspect of, like, you could see other companies going down a similar route, and that's a key learning of this might be complicated and more thorny than you realized.
Awesome. Lots of really great information, Kim. This has been incredible. We still have 17 minutes. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free. We could also talk about tips around putting together a successful presentation itself, and how to structure that. Kim, if you're open to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot we could talk about there in terms of creating a talk. And if people have specific questions about that, I'm happy to field those too. But I can talk a little bit generally about that. I already talked a little bit about sort of the bones of how my own process for how I develop talks on the whole, and really trying to hold myself accountable to honing it in and finding that steel thread, and being very hypercritical about, does this play a role in the talk or not? Because if it doesn't, it's out of here. Get rid of it. It's just it's not it's potentially diluting the talk. Now, there's still stylistic room for things as well too. So I don't think you want to necessarily distill it down to the point where every single word has to be absolutely perfectly positioned to lead up to your stunning conclusion. I think you want to be able to leave space for your personality to come through as well too, and how you like to speak to things. And everyone's going to be a little bit different. I skew pretty cheesy. I am a bit of a ham bone when I'm giving talks. I make silly jokes. I look like a twit, and it's okay. That's just my style and how I like to give talks. And that may work for some, it doesn't work for others. That may work for some audiences, it doesn't work for all audiences. But knowing who you are, because you can best be you. That's the thing you can do better than anything else on stage, is be yourself. And it's something that you've got lots of practice on. So even if you're not necessarily comfortable speaking in front of others, setting a goal of getting closer and closer to your true self is something that is a lot more attainable. So thinking about that in terms of your talk, do you want to work a little bit of humor in? Is that something you're comfortable with? You don't have to. And certainly if you're like, ooh, I don't know about that, I would say, don't worry about it. There's no need for that. You don't have to add that in. Maybe that's something you want to aspire toward in a future talk. But still think about the ways in which your personality comes through and how you can capture that in the talk, because that will help your audience connect with you a little bit more as a person, and that helps a lot. It will also help you connect with the material a little bit more. It sort of starts to feel a little bit more natural to be speaking to this when it's captured in a way that reflects your personality and how you like to communicate. Now, how do you get there? What does that actually look like? Well, it's not just, of course, producing the talk slides and being like, okay, I'm done. You've got to practice. You've got to hone those skills. After years and years and years of giving talks, maybe you don't do that much, like, again and again practicing of a specific talk. I can tell you from experience that eventually you get to a spot where, particularly if it's a topic you speak on a lot, you get to a spot where you can pretty confidently deliver the material after you put it together, and you don't need to do a whole bunch of trial runs. But early on, especially when you're new to speaking, that is invaluable. Or maybe it's a talk where you really want to make sure you nail all the details. Maybe then you'll do a little extra prep. But I'm guessing for probably most people in this audience, you maybe haven't done that much speaking, maybe none at all. And so how you practice is really important too. From the earliest time that you start putting together some notes, creating some space where you can just speak through those points. And I don't just mean reading them out, but I mean talking to them, trying to get yourself comfortable with the idea of taking a concept and producing something that you're comfortable, something that you're comfortable articulating about that point. So there's two ways to really kind of think about a talk and how you prep it. So one is that way. So you're building out a set of points that you can speak to, and you speak to those dynamically on the fly. So more like what I'm doing right now. I'm not looking at any particular notes. I haven't written a script. I'm not following a script. You can probably tell by the way I'm talking, and I slip up a bit here and there. Like, this is not coming from a script. That can, and no judgment, maybe I'm totally wrong here, but that can be a lot more engaging, as hopefully this session is, not sure. But it's harder, right? I have to be in the moment. I have to be generating things, and I might get to things where I'm like, ooh, like for example, asking, can you resubmit a talk? I was like, I can't remember if we have a formal rule around that. So there's things where, you might hit things where you're not necessarily exactly in your comfort zone. And so being comfortable with that is really the goal. So that's one way, and that's, I think, something to build toward. But I think you can still give really good talks where you write out your script a little bit more formally. So for example, the example I was giving earlier about the replayability AI talk, maybe you do write out all of your key points in a fair amount of detail, and then you practice reading those out and getting a better command of them so that you are able to speak to it a little bit more naturally. Kind of a more advanced technique that I encourage people to at least be aware of and think about is, why does it sound differently when you're reading from something versus when you're doing something on the fly? Like, what is it about that is different? And a lot of it comes from a lot of subtle ways in which we articulate things. So the timing of things is a little bit different. The emphasis on things is a little bit different. And so the more aware of those things you are, and you can get more aware of these things by watching talks that you enjoy. So going back through the GDC vault and watching popular talks, the more you can start to look for those things and then try to factor them in through additional practice. So this all takes time. This is not something you're going to overnight be good at. My first an anecdote from my own life, the very first time I had to give a talk at a conference was many years ago. I had an academic paper and I was speaking at an academic conference, and I was so nervous. Oh my gosh. It was a very short talk, maybe 15 minutes or something or so. And it was I don't even remember, it was some AI thing that I had worked on as an undergrad. And I was so nervous. I finished that talk in under 2 minutes. Despite having practiced this 15-minute talk repeatedly, I finished it in under 2 minutes. So, it's a journey. You will get better over time, and that's totally okay. But the more you practice, the thing that I didn't do is practice in front of other people. So I practiced all by myself all the time. And then when I was in front of people, I was like, oh God, what have I done? So find someone you're comfortable with. If I'm your mentor, I'd be happy to be that person and create a safe space, and we can work on it together. But really do focus on that practice piece. And it'll also help you hone it as well, because the more you talk through it, the more you're like, oh, that didn't really build as well there as I wanted, or that didn't feel as natural. And so going through those things repeatedly develops that muscle, helps improve your talk, and gives you more confidence going out onto the stage in the future. Yeah, Nail mentions Toastmasters can be great. I've never personally done it, but I know people that have done it, and it's exactly that. It's lots of practice being able to get up in front of people and speak to various different topics, which is the best you can hope for that kind of practice. I feel like I got very lucky in my career because I spent 10 years as a professor, which meant many times a week I had to get up in front of a large group of people and essentially give a talk, and that very quickly honed, improved my skills. I won't say it's honed. I have lots to learn, lots I can improve in my own public speaking, but it certainly helped me get over that fear and get to a point where, I really enjoy public speaking now. It is a fun exercise to try to articulate something and craft a narrative and meet the audience where they're at and respond to the audience. So I think anyone can get there with time and practice, but just be compassionate and hold yourself accountable to a level that's more in line with where you're at in your career, and keep these few techniques in mind. And then when we do offer you mentorship support, take us up on that. We're totally happy to spend plenty of time with you practicing these things and building out those skills.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I mean, I think public speaking for me, I used to be terrified of it. I still am pretty scared, but it's taken a lot of time and practice that I'm getting more comfortable with it. But I mean, it was like, as soon as just the idea of speaking in front of people, my anxiety brain kicks in and I forget everything I want to say. So a lot of time and practice. I mean, it helps a lot for sure. I have a question actually about having a co-speaker. How do you decide when it's appropriate to have a co-speaker or co-speakers? If it's a lecture, a panel is a bit different, but if you want to submit a lecture and you feel like you would like to have, one or two other people up on stage with you, when do you think it makes sense?
Yeah, so having a co-lecturer can be really helpful for a few reasons. One can be if the nature of what you're talking about has clear, distinct ownership over different pieces. So let's say you're talking about some, I don't know, new technique for, gosh, my creativity engine is not running today. What could it be? I don't know, you're making a new co-op game or something, let's say, and you're talking about design aspects of that. You might want to have someone who specialized on the level design piece speaking a little bit to that, and someone who specialized on the character design speaking to that. And in those cases, it's the pairing is a lot more natural. You're having someone who has greater command of the topic, who's going to be able to probably be more fluent and more comfortable, and so that will in turn result in a better audience experience. So those kinds of situations can be good. I think the main thing though you want to be aware of is that audience experience. I've seen talks, for example, where they basically alternated and went back and forth in fairly quick succession, and that was pretty uncomfortable because you're just sort of getting into the flow of one thing and then it switches over here. And sometimes, if it's done really well, sometimes that can work. There's certain ways I think of delivery that people who have worked together and done this a ton can build off of each other, and it can be super, super good. Well, that's not most of us. Most of us are probably not going to deliver at that level. So I would want to be very careful about the structure and content when you're transitioning to the other person, and making sure those segues are really, really smooth. And that it's justified that you have additional speakers. Sometimes I think what a lot of people end up doing is they submit, I think there's a few different scenarios. One is they submit multiple speakers because maybe they're nervous and they'd feel better having another person up there, which I totally get, can respect that, a lot of compassion for that. But sometimes that's not the best for the talk. And so really thinking about, can you construct a talk effectively with two people in a way that is going to keep people engaged and be clear to follow, so on and so forth. So I think keeping all of that in mind. And if you can't, then even if that's someone that you really want to do this talk, but you'd feel so much better if they were there, I'd probably wait until you had a better topic that you could split between two people, or consider just working toward a goal of being able to get up on stage by yourself. The other reason I see it sometimes is because there's well, the sometimes it's just uncertainty. We don't know. We have to go through and be like, yeah, we're not gonna have 5 speakers on this, so who did you really mean, and things like that. So sometimes it's just that sort of logistical piece, which not a big fan of. Try to get those details clarified up front, because it puts a lot of work on us and it's just rarely clear what you're actually intending. And then the other reason is sometimes strong ownership. So people are like, no, this is my section. I'm going to speak to this section. And again, that can be okay, provided that they can be, whomever you're partnering with can be an effective speaker and is going to be comfortable up on stage. But generally, I think it is harder. It's twice the work. You've got to, in a lot of ways, right? Because you've got to really coordinate with the other person and make sure that you're on the same wavelength, and you've got all of your timing teed up, and you've got to practice that a lot more. You know, if I'm doing a talk with someone, which I've done a few over the years, I'll practice that one a lot more, say, than another one that I'm delivering, just because I know me, I know how I work, I know, after all these years, I'm pretty good at my timing and everything, but it's all harder when you're doing that with another person.
Awesome. Yeah, that all makes sense. Cool. Well, we have 3 minutes left. I want to make sure to keep it open if anyone has any other questions. If you have any questions about the submission process, or tips about putting together a really standout and stellar presentation itself, please feel free to ask. Okay. Well, I guess I have one more question.
Sure.
Do you have any any advice around topics that are best suited for like lectures versus panels versus roundtables, or something around, like, any tips around like how to structure that proposal if it's different from what you've said before?
Yeah, I think panels are an interesting one. It's a lot easier to do a bad panel than I think most people realize. I think as audience members, we all can think back to panels where we were like, yeah, that wasn't so good. So what does it mean to have a good panel? I think it really is, it should be content that is fairly dynamic and where you've put in a lot of prep for the panel. I think a lot of times the reason we end up with a bunch of panel submissions is because speaking of misconceptions, there's a misconception that they're just much less work, because it's just gonna be a conversation. So here's a couple ideas, here's some people, and we'll have a conversation. It'll be great. It's usually not great. It usually doesn't work out very well. So put the effort in to figuring out the topics, figuring out the strengths of each of your speakers, what they really want to speak to. I've seen talks or panels, go way off the rails because someone had an agenda. That's the thing they really wanted to talk to. And it didn't matter what questions you asked, they just steered it right to that. So go do the work to figure out what those topics are, and then give people space to be able to share their thoughts and build a dynamic kind of conversation. You also need to have a strong moderator who can keep people on topic, who can float the conversation if it dries up. So thinking carefully about that. So if you can provide all of those things and you think this is a good conversational topic, a panel can be great. Otherwise, I would default to a lecture and sharing topics that way, or a roundtable is something where you think you could really engage a broader selection of the audience as well. And it's a little bit more free form, and there's a big topic there that's worth exploring. Then again, with a very strong moderator, that can be very effective.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kim. This was filled with a lot of really great information. I know I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming out and answering everyone's questions and my questions. Yeah, thank you so much. That was great.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck. Hope to see your submissions.
Thank you. Yes. So hope to see your submissions. See you at GDC 24.